Imre Szeman is University Research Chair of Environmental Communication and Professor of Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo. He's also co-founder of the Petrocultures Research Group, a member of the International Panel on Behavior Change, and a fellow of the Canadian International Council. Over the years, his writing has made an enormous impact on my thinking, so I was thrilled to hear that he had decided to enter politics in this year's snap election. So he explains in this interview why he made that decision to embrace the challenges of campaigning. He was offered a rare opportunity to serve as the Green Party of Canada's senior climate critic and write radical, innovative climate policy to test the translatability, he says, of political theory in ways that he hadn't had a chance to before. I ask him about his sense that any radical plan for energy transition has to have a plan B, a game plan that doesn't just dismantle but rebuilds by attending to the needs of communities. This is different from what Szeman calls the trope of hope, a tendency that actually he feels ignores the reality on the ground. And part of that reality, crucially, is the fact of communication itself. And Imre notes that it hasn't gotten any easier to communicate about the environment in a way that encourages action. And while he admits he doesn't have any easy answers, he really stresses that we need to ask questions about what generates effective communication. Like, for example, is referencing the colossal, hard-to-cognize problem of the environment a better move than trying to appeal to the concerns of small, local collectivities? What does technology, or what Szeman calls technologically inflected revolutionary politics, communicate, if anything, about action and the need for revolutionary social change? Does technology in any way actually convey the need to move politically into a post-fossil fuel future? And if it doesn't, is that a fatal flaw? And we spend a lot of time considering these questions, but we also talk about the thought experiments in Kim Stanley Robinson's sprawling opus of a climate fiction novel, The Ministry for the Future. Imre expresses admiration for how Robinson deals directly with the messiness of the political rather than moving past all these conflicts and contradictions toward, a convenient conclusion that replaces our chaotic system of capitalism with a better one. So while the mess, he says, can be dispiriting to look at, Szeman insists that this is what he wants to understand. And he's not alone. As he notes, there's never been a moment where the impacts of colonialism were more visible. The environment is, in a sense, being invoked as a new political actor, as an active agent in revolutionary politics. This fact of a rising consciousness of a larger network or system that exceeds capitalism and that totally transcends human desire means that it has never been clearer that the world is inescapably interconnected. The first thing I want to do is kind of stress your particular impact on the field of energy humanities, as it's sort of now known, this multidisciplinary field that is producing a lot of inventive scholarship interventions on the climate crisis. And whenever I think about your work in particular, which is, quite vast, I think about one essay, this essay, The Political Nature of Things, that you wrote on David Suzuki.
Mm-hmm.
And, in that essay, you give, to my mind, a really eloquent articulation of what the energy humanities is sort of about. You say, engaging with problems that are embedded in the very structure of contemporary systems, political, social, economic, and ecological, or often all of these taken together, intellectuals who attend to structure make a radical and difficult demand on the publics to which they speak. Not that they vote differently, or that they drive or consume less, but that they consider moving collectively in an entirely new direction, one whose form and outcome cannot be easily mapped or imagined concretely in advance. That is a hard sell, I think, politically, it seems. And this discursive battle between the NDP and the Green Party in Canada over the logistics of energy transition, exactly how it will happen, and what can be preserved of the existing fossil fuel infrastructure has maybe never been more pitched. And so it's in this context that I'm a little bit shocked that you ran for office. A person who believes in structural critique clearly and in moving entirely in a different direction. And so, you end up running in Kelowna for the Green Party seat. And I guess I wondered, why or how you ended up running, and how, you brought your own sense of the need for like a massive overhaul, a dismantling of the system as it is, to these debates. I mean, was that difficult to do?
Wow, Scott, you just get right down to the issues, don't you?
I try.
Um, thanks, thanks for that opening comment. I suppose I should just talk a little bit about the the phrase or the paragraph that you grabbed from the essay on David Suzuki, which is a sentiment and an argument that I've made in other places in different ways. And it's something that I've taken to saying more and more when I'm asked to speak about the energy humanities, a field or movement for which I become a spokesperson without ever intending to have done so. And what I've said recently and vociferously is that in thinking about energy, I really am not interested in the dynamics of energy per se. I'm not being a little bit coy there. But what I'm really interested in is how the specific problem of energy and other commitments that we've made, structural commitments, long term commitments to specific modes of living, how those commitments suggest that what we're asking for when we think about attending to climate crisis is really revolution. The language that you read from the Suzuki article, which I must admit I don't remember that specific language. When you read it to me, it sounded to me like somebody writing about politics. Somebody could have said those exact same things without any without saying anything about climate or about energy. It's about making deep changes of a kind that would produce some other kind of system entirely.
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay,
a kind of
so
abolitionist politics maybe as well.
absolutely. Or I suppose it's saying that the problem before us is of such a large degree that we're not going to do it within existing systems, especially within the time frame available to us. If
Hmm.
indeed that's the demand that many on the left and many concerned with the environment are making. So then you ask a good question, which is how, I'm asking, if I'm suggesting that what we need to do is something akin to political revolution of a different sort at a different moment, one that didn't take into account climate, why would I join an established party in Canada, and indeed a party that had seats prior to the most recent election and still has seats actually in parliament. So I can't protest and say that this is really a party that stands outside the majority and isn't actively participating in discussions around climate change in Canada. It is. I was asked to participate in the various debates of those in each party that attended to environment.
So you had to deal with, yeah, like political realism, like the norms
Absolutely.
of political civility and this kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. This was about stepping into a role that I don't know very much about in some ways. And I decided to do it for a couple of reasons. So, one was that I was given the opportunity to be the climate critic for the Green Party as somebody with very limited um, time in the Green Party. So, I kind of went to the top quickly, from a new member to somebody that was arguably one of the one or two most important people in terms of developing policy. And I couldn't resist the opportunity to do just that, shape policy for one of the parties in Canada, and to see how an electorate responds to
Sure.
that. A second thing is that I had long harbored I was going to say an ambition, but that's the wrong word. I had wanted to see what the kind of work that academics do, especially academics broadly in the field of what could be called critical theory, what that kind of work, what that kind of political work, how that operates with a broader segment of the population. And I wanted to see if there was any translatability.
And I mean, what did you find? I mean, it's such an odd transition in a way, academia to politics, and maybe one that shouldn't be as awkward as it sometimes is. And there's obviously a kind of problem of perceived or real elitism
Yeah.
that limits voters, I think, from identifying maybe with like academics as political leaders. It's something that Kim Stanley Robinson has actually talked about. Like he's taken issue with the broadness of that category, elite. AOC has gone off at the Republicans for claiming that the Green New Deal is an elitist document, right? It's hard to articulate radical demands, especially from that like academic position without, you know, while staying legitimately public, as you once put it in an article. Any thoughts on that question of expertise or elitism and how to negotiate that, or how you negotiated that?
One of the defining features of the shadow cabinet for the Green Party for this past election is that it's chock full of people with PhDs and professors and other experts in their field. And this
Hmm.
was a deliberate decision on the part of the then leader, Annamie Paul, to show that the Green Party was taking the issues seriously, perhaps more seriously than other parties. Um, in Canada, as in other countries that work with the parliamentary system, the ministers are appointed by the prime minister, and often ministers will have no specific expertise in any given ministry. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so she wanted to show off something else, so that if there was somebody working, if there's a minister of defense, we would have a shadow cabinet minister that was an expert in defense policy, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was deliberate. That was a way to show, especially in environment and in green transition and in natural resources, that she was taking the issues as seriously as possible, and she was putting experts in those areas.
And I
Now,
think, that, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and I would say that in the Canadian context, I did not find that my constituents in Kelowna Lake Country, nor any of the journalists I've talked to during the both during the campaign and before and since, had any issues with the idea of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
At least with this specific position, they found it appropriate to have an expert on climate or on the environment discussing issues of the environment. Nor did I have any kind of pushback from any of the other candidates. So I don't know if it's a specific issue with respect to the environment, and there
Yeah, maybe.
maybe there's some expectation that it makes sense now for a scientist or a social scientist to discuss these issues. But I was very pleased to find that that wasn't the case, and if anything, there was some concession to points that I would make, because there was some presumption that I knew something about them more than the other members, other people I was debating or competing against, which wasn't always the case, probably.
Hmm. One exchange I remember during an online panel that you took part in was really striking, where you kind of collided with some of like the impasses, I think, of political discourse. So you were, running, contributing to a party that was sort of embroiled in this internal conflict and this controversy. And after a panel discussion focused entirely on climate, a reporter, of course, intervened to try and catch Annamie Paul in her kind of in this apparent political snafu, right? And you absolutely tore into that reporter, and saying, you're actually kind of hijacking an important discussion for this, clearly kind of sensationalistic reason. And I thought that was so interesting that you didn't even engage with the question. You actually kind of you know, jumped in. And I guess like the question for me was like, what motivated, if you remember that intervention, like what motivated it, and why do you think like that gotcha politics thing is so antithetical to climate action?
I remember it very well. This is a Toronto Star reporter that seems to have made his career over the past 6 months by being very attentive to the developments happening in the Green Party. And during
Hmm.
that debate, um, which was nationally broadcast, he wanted to make sure to continue to play out his role. And I found it frustrating that he would play these professional games when the discussion was about something much more significant than that. And
Hmm.
I suppose I couldn't help, anyone that knows me knows that sometimes I can't, perhaps can't shut up. And I just felt there was nothing to lose to
Hmm.
draw attention to precisely the limits in discussions that should be taking place around these issues, because other things emerge to the actors in a discussion, in this case the journalist, as more important,
Hmm.
and that just seemed to me to be indefensible.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
It like rattled the discussion in a way that I thought was productive. And like, I want to get to a discussion of the Ministry for the Future, which is one of the two big books that I suggested we could talk about today. And that's something that happens at key moments in that text. Like, an angry, traumatized person, angrily interrupts this kind of, this idle observation of the crisis. That I think is something that is refreshing, a kind of wake up call, and something that the media, I think, has been utterly irresponsible on, in terms of like actually like fomenting the appropriate outrage. Like the National recently in the reporting on COP26 is mostly like, if you watch it, it's mostly touting its own climate coverage,
Mm.
like its own mode of engagement, which is still obviously couched in what you call this techno utopian hope of like net zero by 2050, a thing they choose, I think, deliberately not to unpack because it's sort of too complex. It could turn your audience off. I don't know. Um, I think I feel as though these representational decisions matter, and as a student of cultural studies, like I think that I don't want to dismiss these big events like COP26, or just in general, moments like this congressional hearing in which major stakeholders, as it were, within the oil industry are being interrogated, in some cases shamed. Like, to me, the optics of these events kind of matter. And I guess like I wanted to ask, in terms of your own watching of the coverage of COP26, what is your sense of maybe what's different this time about the discourse? Like, this is the whitest COP ever,
Right.
apparently, due to the pandemic and the outsized decimation of poor countries. You've got like Greta Thunberg showing up with this hero's reception. Like, this is a huge event. And I guess like, how are you decoding it right now?
How one decodes it depends on the information one is getting about it. And so
Yeah.
if one is getting information by actors inside of it that may be mm, fit your own political um, valence, you get one set of ideas about it. And if you get it through various kinds of media, you of course get another. So that's just one thing I'll say about decoding it. I think that you have raised some really good points, which is that this is about representation, or this is about communication. At this point now, the environment is entirely about the struggle over what it looks like to take action, and whether what kinds of action are quote unquote realistic, which kinds of actions make sense in terms of economic practice, which are kind of supposedly irrational or irrelevant.
Mm.
This is, I feel like, we're in this phase now where these are the kinds of things that are being played out, and played out in a sophisticated way, by everybody, by the oil industry, by right-wing newspapers like the National Post, even by right-wing parties in Canada. It has struck me, and I think others have said the same thing, that we're now in this interregnum around climate, which is very different than there being climate deniers and the rest of us.
Yeah.
Um, the US might be the sole exception where there's some climate deniers, but for the most part, the political discussion has moved on to some kind of messy center that everybody is fighting over. And the center, of course, there's no such thing as a center, right? It looks like what you want it to look like and shape it by discourse.
Hmm.
So that center, into that center is pushing right-wing interests, or even kind of center-right interests. And what it's doing is making the left appear to be demanding too much, too fast. There's a recognition of the importance of climate, but then some attention to kind of who are adults in the room and who are not. And the National Post started the discourse about COP and about the environment in the election very early on. They started to have op-eds from previously very right-wing columnists. I mean, they're still right-wing, but on the environment, and even some columnists who were formerly in the oil industry. They had columns where they were saying that absolutely we have to do something about the environment. Climate change is real. Anybody who doesn't think that is crazy. But, and what comes after the but is the significant part.
Yeah.
They were saying, let's be clear about how much reduction has to take place. Let's look at the reality of the Canadian economy, and on and on and on. So COP26 comes at a period where it's really uncertain where things are going to go, I think. Or let's just say how fast they'll go.
That's the question. And certainly the focus of Ministry for the Future is this, disbelief at the inaction of like governments globally in the face of even just unbelievable climate impacts. That even after massive, spectacular, undeniable loss of life, there's still this entrenched inaction. And I hope we can do kind of a close reading maybe of that book. But I guess I want to ask you, about the other, what I take to be like the other big event in terms of the optics perhaps of the climate struggle, and that is this congressional hearing, and whether you feel as though this trial, as it were, is more a form of just like political theater or something more real, a potential shift in the political climate. Holly Jean Buck, for example, talks in After Geoengineering about a shift that sees more lawsuits, more shaming of people who are implicated in the fossil industry, and also divestment. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see something like that congressional hearing primarily as political theater, or something bigger, I suppose, or is it just part of this interregnum that's hard to define?
My response is always going to be this unsatisfactory, like a little bit of both and a big mess somewhere in the middle. So it is certainly political theater. It will always be played out in that fashion. The question is how this communicates to publics and how this communicates to policymakers, what this means to activist groups and to NGOs. So is it a mechanism by which to ameliorate the challenges that NGOs like 350.org, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty organizations are making around the necessity to shut down fossil fuel right away? Or is it in fact a way of extending the fossil fuel industry for however long it can go? Probably a little bit of both. I'm not convinced that the industry can be shamed. There are individuals in the industry that can be shamed, but this is a non-state actor that is made up of lots of individuals, shareholders, institutional shareholders. It's harder to move a corporation around, or at least to make it feel bad.
Right. Even when you expose this long suppressed truth, right? like the Facebook papers. Like, are they really going to affect anything? Like, is this revelation
Mhm.
going to register as one? And I feel as though it won't. I mean, the idea that you're approaching the trial of these oil executives in this kind of we're suspending judgment, we're trying to maintain balance. Like that makes this scene of political theater to me completely innocuous. Like White Skin, Black Fuel, one of the books I mentioned we could discuss in the chapter Fortunes of Denial, charts climate misinformation and how these companies have been at the heart of it. And yet it's being treated as an allegation in these congressional hearings, right? And you have, at the same time that it's being treated as a potential accusation, the GOP accusing those that are, putting these people on trial of actually putting on trial an entire way of life.
It may well be asking for them to be put on trial is precisely then the wrong messaging. And then so one has to ask why that's happening. Is it the Democrats in the US struggling to save their own skin as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
taking action? It's again a kind of a delay tactic of kinds where, yeah, once again, this kind of information gathering, which which we know from a number of different books and sources, these industries have known for half a century.
Absolutely. And so, the question becomes, in some ways, like, how do you diagnose the production of like gridlock in this
Mhm.
space? Like, how does it happen? And I think that's part of what Ministry for the Future is about. Is, like it, you know, Robinson explains, for example, the way the ministry works through these disciplinary divisions, analysis, and nothing more. Like, you talk about this, in fact, in your Suzuki article, the problem of categorization and category errors in limiting our ability to sort of see the big picture. This is the argument that Robinson's making, especially in like chapter 25, this huge pivotal chapter, where the inaction of the UN is imagined to be really based in its addiction to like scenario modeling
Mhm.
and so on, and like a kind of endless deferral. On that point, I guess I wanted to ask you about the way in which Robinson, in his books and in his sort of public communication, approaches the question of technology, of science and technology, right? Like, because it seems to me in your work, you're much more open to like the potential of science to liberate us, but it seems like Robinson is like far more like dismayed by this sort of eco-socialist left that sees all technology as problematic.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, I guess, about geoengineering and the rise of that among the kind of eco-socialist left as a, techno-utopian hope that is seen as like genuinely valid as a means out of the crisis that we face. Are you kind of sympathetic to the use of technology to help us slam on the
Mhm.
brakes when it comes to emissions?
Those are all fantastic questions. I have so much to say about all of them. Let me take this from a slightly different angle, and then we'll see if we can move back to through some of those questions. So I'm my new position is in environmental communications. I've always been really, if I had to describe what I do cultural studies in a kind of critical theory tradition, and I've long bridged the humanities and the social sciences. I don't think I could have just been a humanist. I am committed to certain kinds of knowledge production about social practices that I think are really valuable. So now I'm in environmental communication, and what I've been learning about the field is not somebody. It's not a field that I've done my research in for most of my career. Is that it's very hard to communicate about the environment in a way that generates action, whether
Mm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
action by institutions or it's by action by individuals. So if you were to read any articles about environmental communication, for the most part they're despondent. They'll be of the kind where some researchers will come and show 50 families how to turn their appliances to a low energy saving mode, and then we'll come back a month later and find that maybe 10% of them have done that. And it takes no effort, doesn't take you to change your attitudes towards capitalism. It doesn't require you to become socialist, any of those things. It's just a small mechanistic change. Okay, so why I go at it this way is that technology is a tool, but it also communicates very powerfully. And it does so with a special power, I think, in our society now. And I think whether you believe it's a solution or not solution, whether you think the technology itself offers some capacities, some possibilities vis-a-vis the environment, the limit that I find always, or what worries me about it, is that what it communicates is that nothing has to be done socially. Nothing has to be done actually politically, because whether or not we manage to make the technological innovation now, down the road, scientists will save us from ourselves. Technology will come into play that will make it unnecessary to make the big changes. We'll be able to have our giant Ford 150 truck, but now it'll be electric, without any sense of then where the electricity comes from. And so that to me is my real objection to technology, is that what it communicates about action and what it communicates about the need to do what you read to me from the Suzuki article, that need to do that kind of revolutionary social change, which is to undo those commitments we've made to fossil fuels and other kinds of negative environmental practices. So just to kind of then go to these other sites now, the renewed commitments or interest in technologically inflected revolutionary politics that one finds, say, in Bastani's Fully Automated Luxury Communism, or in Inventing the Future.
Xenofeminist Manifesto.
Yeah.
Wendy Liu has that book, Abolish Silicon Valley. It's about liberating technology. Yeah.
That's right. So on the one hand, what could be more amazing to have these tools that now are put to one kind of use potentially to be put to another. But the movement from here to there, even to get people on board politically, is really what's at the heart of technological messaging. So I like these manifesto style books. Their audience is quite limited to academics. So honestly, they're making an argument to academics about how the puzzle pieces fit together and how the numbers might run. I'm sorry to be so critical. If they're put forward to publics to say that there will be this incredible utopia without work, as long as you have faith in technology, the political part of it just evaporates.
That's true.
And it's really the mess of the political and communicating the political, which is the hard part now. We're coming to this, that we couldn't be in a worse situation.
Yeah, the pandemic has shown that technology is not itself transformative.
That's right.
It's just not. Yeah.
So I'll give you, we come to the necessity of dealing with the climate crisis after this protracted societal shift called neoliberalism, and one that is global. We have limited tools as a result to make the kinds of changes we need. Now, to me, it's not very political to say, let's have a Green New Deal, right? Insofar as excellent, looks great on paper. The politics of it is, how do you get that to be activated? There's the Green New Deal, of course, is either connected back. There's two different kinds of metaphors. One is, of course, to the old New Deal. Another one that has been trotted out a lot by people such as George Monbiot is, look at all the things we did for World War II. Why can't we do that now?
Right. A war mobilization footing is the argument. Yeah.
So excellent. But who is the we that is being spoken to?
Right.
This is always, I feel like the difficulty isn't to diagnose the problem. The difficulty that I'm kind of stuck with and trying to figure out with my colleagues is what happens in the interim. So, coming back to Kim Stanley Robinson's um, work, but let's just say Ministry of the Future, I what I really admire about the book is that it actually, whether or not he has a specific interest in technology, which I think he does, um, it it attends to and it allows itself to be stuck in this really tricky morass.
Yeah. The geoengineering, the way geoengineering is implemented, right? It's not just a
How,
slick, streamlined thing.
geoengineering happens in a flash.
Yeah.
It's not discussed over. But then you have, when I try to describe the book to people, I say, um, jokingly, oh, he explains how um, federal banks manage to create a situation that can deal with climate change. Okay, so if you say it
Hmm.
like that, it's not very sexy.
No.
But the fact that he's willing to go there
And think through it. Yeah.
um, and think through it, and along the way, I mean, what's so rich about the book is that it's an assembly of a ton of voices. There's
Mm.
a through thread,
Hmm.
but it comes into focus fairly, like, not that often actually, between I voices describing their situation, um, some quite I think some brutal critique towards a certain kind of left political practice in the chapter on Davos,
Hmm.
which is also hilarious. Um, does it end with wind-powered, um, technologically efficient sailboats taking us across the ocean so they don't generate electricity, or with zeppelins or things like this? Yes, but I don't think those are the drivers in that book. Those are not the drivers of the change.
No.
The fact that he even chooses to position the book, the narrative, in a yet to be developed UN ministry that from the get go, those in the ministry feel is it's a little bit of a ruse. They don't really have the resources they need. It's unclear how they can convince other leaders or other agencies what to do. And so they have to find this complicated way to do it. So I don't see that book, which I admire greatly. I don't see it using technology in the way um, that it's used in fully automated luxury communism or inventing the future. Both I should say, I'm not being dismissive of these books,
No, no.
but I feel that I want more of the mess of the political that I don't know how to
Right.
describe.
Yeah, those books feel oracular.
Yes, it's part of where we're stuck with the environment. I
Hmm.
read and again admired this new short book by Benjamin Bratton called The Revenge of the Real.
Yeah, that's a
I
great
think the
book.
subtitle is called Politics for a Post-Pandemic World. And it is meant to be essayistic. And the argument there in relationship to COVID, what would have been the better approach to COVID, but also by extension, what would be a better politics moving forward, is kind of what he calls a positive biopolitics. Okay, so Bratton doesn't mind facial recognition. He doesn't mind many kinds of things. It's kind of this sense of if you have the right kind of biopolitics, you get you get places. And
Hmm.
I agree with him insofar as there's been a tendency to view biopolitics as always already negative, and I don't think that holds up in the latter Foucault, where he's describing the emergence of a system. Okay, so all well and good. What I kept writing in the margins of that book is, who runs it? Like, how do you make sure it's the right kind of people? How do you make sure it's not the Chinese state? Um, how do you get from here to there? Like, again, it's making an argument to readers of verso texts like me, who loves being in the space of these ideas, and I couldn't think without these kind of interlocutors, but it does get to the conclusion quickly, or it does
I like that.
produce
Yeah.
a sense of some missing elements that when I look at more like kind of just more left inflected social science, they're trying always in these kind of micro ways, kind of like micro narratives of how is it that how is it that a community reacts to this narrative? What happens when you introduce solar? Like my colleague Jamie Cross at University of Edinburgh, he's done a lot of work in Africa about um, the implementation of solar power by international agencies in small communities and previously off the grid communities, which sounds great. But then what unfolds is very compelling if you actually look on the ground, especially as those agencies very often bring in private industry after the fact to kind of run things. So, it's that kind of like that mess on the ground that can be very dispiriting to look at is to me what I want to know about. And kind of come back to the question of the Green Party. I suppose then there's two mechanisms that I'm thinking, or two kind of angles that are, I'm not sure how they're going to come together because I'm not sure they did during the election. So one is this conceptual, philosophical attention to political forms, um, analyses of the inadequacy of current forms, and the elaboration of ones that would be better, which we could not do without.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that part of it. How do I bring that together with all of the challenges and with a recognition that if everything went right, the end point would still be different than diagnosed in fully automated luxury communism, right? So yeah, so and I am Kim Stanley Robinson is pretty good about that as both a work of theory and perhaps of practice.
Yeah, dwelling with the messiness of it. Like, this is something that Angela Davis says that she appreciates most about feminist thought, that it troubles our neat analyses, she says, that it makes us deal with a messy world. I'm quoting her, it makes us recognize social realities that don't always reflect the neatness of our analytical categories, and that we have to be willing to try to begin to approximate the messiness of social reality. Like, I hear you saying that, like, there has to be a kind of feminist pragmatism to our political analysis too, that doesn't, as you say, kind of jump to the conclusion. And yeah, I mean, like, this is what I really appreciated about White Skin Black Fuel, this large analysis of the relationship between anti-climate politics of the anti-climate politics of the far right and denialism, and the material interests of dominant classes. Like, that's a kind of messy analysis that tries to, as it says, as they say in the text, develop a reading of the political ecology of the far right, which they see as sorely lacking. Right? What was your sense of, like, the moves that book makes in terms of, especially sort of indicting the capitalist class for being, of the mind that the erasure of oil is life threatening? Like, there's this also, I mean, in that, I'll say one more thing, like, there's also in that text this sense that, Trump is not an anomaly, right? He's the ubiquitous face of anti-climate politics, but he's not reflective, rather, of a Republican eccentricity or even a Trumpian idiosyncrasy. And I guess, like, in terms of trying to understand the messiness of these collusions, do you think we're guilty of the same kind of individualistic thinking in Canada, perhaps, like vilifying Trudeau in the way that we do? Is there this universal tendency, perhaps, to just focus on loud leaders and how they affect the popular capacity to see this system of capitalizing basically on waste as, emerging at a particular moment in the history of capitalist modes of production? Do we focus basically too much on the Trumps and Trudeaus and forget the messiness of these political ecologies?
All I can say is yes, absolutely. If one had to do a mapping, and there are projects that have done this kind of mapping. I'm thinking of, I'm gonna get the name wrong, but there was a mapping project of West Coast political power and political actors in relation to fossil fuels, run out of the University of Victoria by William Carroll. Was a professor there, and he had a co-leader that was a member of the Canadian Center for Policy, what is it, analysis, policy, CCPA, out of the BC office. So that was part of the work they wanted to do, precisely to get to that kind of messiness, to look at all of the different actors that are in the political ecology. The commitments that the Liberal Party has to, just as one small example, the commitments that the Liberal Party has to oil and to natural resource extraction are as deep as the Conservative Party. And that focus on the principal actors, so in this case, it might be towards the Conservative Party leader in Canada, means that the party that has been in power the most over the last 100 years in Canada, the Liberal Party, and which is effectively the government, so they're almost one and the same. There's not very much interrogation of what they do at that kind of state actor level. The movement back and forth between industry and government is also something I don't think Canadians attend to very much. Nor is there a sense that the production of knowledge is connected deeply to political processes, especially in political science, in a way I think is better known in the US. So there is this kind of broad elite, like bureaucratic organizational class in Canada that eludes analysis by Canadians themselves, to a lesser degree within the academy. But it's that organization that makes it hard to undo what's happening in Canada vis-a-vis climate change. Canada is an abysmal actor on climate. It is the only G20 country since the Paris Agreement not to have reduced its greenhouse gas emissions at all. And we've been flatlined for about 20 years.
Yeah, we've lost any kind of credibility. It's true.
Yeah. And yet, here we are at the beginning of COP20.
Yeah.
And Trudeau is suddenly the hero of the moment, seemingly out of nothing, because he comes across, I think he comes across the world, of course, the way he looks and his affect, but also there's this kind of sensibility, especially in terms of aesthetics.
Yeah.
And how Canadians hold themselves in the world, that we're Scandinavia. We're a variant of Scandinavia. I'll just say one other thing that kind of comes back to Malm and the Zetkin Collective's book, which is specific to Canada, and that is the problem called Alberta. And Alberta is a important heat sink for the rest of the politics of the country in relationship to resource extraction. So as long as Alberta is messy, domineering, right-wing, then all attention is there and not everywhere else. It's not on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It's not on institutional actors. It becomes the only problem. And it's a problem both for its own internal politics, but really what it does to the rest of the country. And I was thinking a lot when I was reading the book about whether the comments and the analyses that are made in White Skin, Black Fuel about fascist and populist politics in various countries, they don't look at Canada or the US, whether it works in the Canadian case, especially with Alberta. And it's trickier. It would require some real thinking through, and that's something I'm sort of at the beginning points of doing.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there are all of these different like polarities or something. There's polarization, but it's a dizzying sort of polarization in Canada where they on at the end of White Skin Black Fuel they talk about Trudeau as doing the denialist, cognitively dissonant, but apparently totally manageable work of a capitalist state in one person.
Mm.
They say basically like, this is a person who will say to investors, we're going to develop all available resources without hesitation, while also saying that all of the right things about the environment, right? And they say like that is iconic of the kind of contemporary, petrocultural leader, you know? And I wonder, like when I was reading that, is it even effective to expose the idleness of dialogue, of earnest, discourse over climate change? Like there's now this Greta Thunberg gave this speech in which, she's kind of using this dismissive mantra of treating all conversation as pointless by saying blah blah blah, net zero, blah blah blah. you know is that potentially dangerous? I want to get in a second to the question of whether, and Mom has written about this, and so have many others, at a certain point in the impasse over energy transition, violence becomes necessary. Like this seems to be almost the implication now of a lot of this kind of discourse, and it's certainly, of course, throughout Ministry for the Future. What do you think is at stake in that dismissive mantra of treating all conversation about this as like just blah blah blah, just white noise?
I hope that that's not what Thunberg is doing in the end, but I can see that's happening. I think it's it was actually more of a journalistic dismissal of what was going to come out before anything happened,
Mm-hmm.
more than I think on the behalf of NGOs and activists. But kind of day one, sort of like hour -1 of COP, the Guardian said effectively like, oh, and nothing's going to be accomplished here. It's the end of it's the end. Um,
Mm,
well,
it's the end.
it doesn't really help
Ouch.
to start there. Um, I think that there has to be some, here's where philosophy does come back in, and here's where communications come back in. There's not much attention to what generates effective communication. It's still at the point where there's a lot of data circulating. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if we don't do this reduction by this time, it produces a certain increase in temperature. Okay, I spend my I read about this every day. I'm not still sure what that means for anything. Like I kind of feel like if I understood that, there's still going to be basically liberal capitalism um, on the horizon. You know,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it'll be center right, and that'll be like a decent way to live for some of us. So that's one thing. If one says that nothing's going to come out of it, or it's blah blah blah, that's also a communication strategy that is ultimately intended to have an audience. Is that audience decision makers? Is it publics? I think the people that are left out of this are actually publics. That there's this kind of protracted struggle on the part of decision makers over what kind of knowledge should be put to use in managing this like knowledge object called the environment, which has
Mm-hmm.
always been about data and about lots and lots of people producing data to learn about it, to manage it, to think about which actors have legitimacy in managing it. So it's still that kind of struggle amongst, no, like whatever the public is, very, you and I know it's a kind of a suspect category, but
Right.
nevertheless, this kind of sense of citizenry making decisions,
Mm-hmm.
that's not where all of this is. That's not what this is communicating. And I don't think there's much attention to that way of like getting some kind of action that would be perhaps local in a very real way, that would be about connecting people who have been disconnected through social media networks, but also neoliberalism. That may have nothing to do about the environment, this giant kind of problem. That would be producing political networks that are distinct from this kind of bigger network. So blah 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 is a strategy within a kind of struggle over knowledge systems. Is it an expression of what, like, broad disconnect or discontent? I'm not sure about that. Let's just say I nobody made her a spokesperson.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, So I do think still there's this discursive struggle, communicative struggle. A lot of that discursive struggle is not well thought through. It's perhaps best thought through by those on the right who have been paying attention to this now for, again, 50 years of neoliberalism. They really have spent time on how you get publics to accept your point of view. So they are likely to have success in their work on climate. Maybe already these kinds of discussions are about that. It's about governments making decisions about what works for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I personally really like that. I think it's just as it's energizing, and it reminds me of something, Judith Butler said when I interviewed her, that it's not decided yet, right? I kind of framed the question as though the pandemic was over, and that the capitalist system had come back in and kind of reimposed a system of exploitation, and she kind of just stressed that it's not decided. And to me, that is energizing. Like, it's something Robinson talks about in like his interview with the Dig podcast. This idea of working together on a discursive battle, and navigating a world in which words themselves are kind of increasingly abstract. The society is increasingly visual, and so images become really crucial as a way of making these things tangible and visible. And you see that obviously in Ministry for the Future, but you even see it in White Skin Black Fuel. Like, they say at the very beginning of that book that the goal is projection, extrapolating and speculating on the possible political climates of the future, rather than like just substantiating the reality of the emergency we face. So they're trying to actually invent metaphors, images, ways for people to understand the pressure cooker that they're in. And even like going as far as to say every metaphor of the climate crisis fails to do justice to its object, while at the same time trying to do just that, right?
Mm.
And I guess I wanted to ask you, like, to go back to Ministry for the Future, like, there has been this huge explosion of like climate fiction, of cli-fi, as a means of generating a complex awareness on the among various publics. But I guess I wanted to ask, like, how do you account for the ways in which it seems like visual culture lags behind climate
Mm.
fiction? Like, Robinson refers to the famous adage of like it being easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Is there more room for that imagining within climate fiction?
That's an interesting question. So there's two different things that you're saying there. So one has to do with um, how whether there's visual representations
Hmm.
akin to climate fiction, and the other is about whether climate fiction can, I guess, imagine the end of capitalism.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the object to which it's trying to do justice, I suppose, is like an actual rendering of this transformation of the banking system, for example, right? The idea of a carbon coin transforming the globe, these kinds of things.
I think in the case of Robinson, that may be true. I'm not sure a lot of other climate fiction that I know of is very attentive to capitalism, except in a indirect way.
Hmm.
Capitalism becomes kind of the present, or it becomes the way we live now, or it becomes an unfeasible system, um,
Hmm.
but not distinct as a ideological political economic practice. It's just kind of the commitments that were made to a specific kind of life with all of its problems, consumerism, and so on. They don't necessarily, bizarrely, are not tied to capitalism per se.
Mm.
So they, I would say, climate fiction, again, I'm massively overgeneralizing, but for the most part, still tends to be somewhat dystopian. And perhaps it's in the dystopian gesture that there's a bit of a kind of false consciousness about the inability to render capitalism as the messy thing that might linger afterward, or which you have to kind of move past, and it's not going to give you the satisfaction of rendering some entirely new system. Um, I think Robinson is more aware of that. I mean, in Ministry of the Future, there's still capitalism.
Hmm.
You know, it's not any kind of end of work society at all.
Yeah, and that's a conscious choice, right?
Yeah,
He talks about the need to provide a credible path forward. And like again, I feel like we're coming back to this rift between the NDP and the Green Party. The notion of a
yeah,
credible path forward, it kind of contradicts the claim in the Suzuki piece about a future that we can't necessarily anticipate, like or know the contours of in advance. This is a text that's valuable in some ways because it's as he puts it, utopian fiction that's trying to make things better in tangible ways. Like
yeah,
it's digestible in these ways, right? And he talks about like the audacity of that in some ways. And it is audacious, and I would say like one of the things that's maybe audacious about it is its depiction of violence. And while this makes the text in some ways dystopian, there are those who imagine that this kind of counter violence is potentially the only way out, that the ruling classes will not be persuaded.
hmm
And I guess I wanted to ask you about this because it's definitely like not a thing I don't see it appearing in your work.
yeah,
An engagement with the question of political counter violence.
yeah.
Do you want to just I mean, I could frame the question, but do you want to just kind of give your general attitude, I guess, toward like revolutionary violence as a source of liberation?
Sure. So I haven't attended to it specifically, or even other kinds of I don't specific
Hmm.
political trajectories to date because I just haven't given it enough attention, I think. I will say this though about Malm's version of it, which is that I I feel that it's also he makes an interesting case for
Hmm.
the necessity of violence. Um, there are some presumptions in there which I'll talk about in 1 minute, which I think are the like important ones to foreground. Perhaps again as like maybe this is the real politics that's lying behind this kind of call to violence. It's similar to automated luxury communism in a way that might surprise you to hear me say that. Sorry, the problem is the following. You know, things have to happen on a very short in a very short time frame.
Hmm.
You have to be committed enough to whatever it is that is the end goal in order to commit yourself to a politics which is a politics of speed. That's the where violence comes in, right? The necessity of generating something quickly and in relationship to a problem that is perceived.
Right. Let's just blow it up.
Yeah. So having said that, um, I do feel that it's a little bit, um, and I'm actually thinking of the COVID book, where in the last chapter, he articulates this sense of violence, of revolutionary practice, for the first time, followed by the How to Blow Up a Pipeline book. There's this sense that of elaborating like what you should do on the basis of the conceptual issues of the moment. So, you know, this won't work, that won't work. Time has to be factored into it. And so, what we need in the COVID book kind of ends up being like it would the best way to do this is we have a kind of Leninist political state that we get to by immediately like kind of destroying all the existing capitalist bureaucracies on the planet, and we finally get to that state, we can act with the speed that we need to because we have a singular government, you know. And then there's always this sense, because again it's a to some degree a political philosophy experiment that's not meant as a criticism at all, that's what
Hmm.
it is. I always have these kind of questions again in the side notes, kind of like who guarantees the decisions made by that government. How do I know it's going to do the right things? What evidence do current totalitarian governments give to us about their actions or previous ones? You know, there's this sense that a certain kind of government will make the right decisions after some kind of action happens. And so I guess I think you can't theorize the violence. I think it happens in outside of the the pages of a verso book. I'm being a little bit too
Polemical?
uh, polemical. I don't mean it that way.
No, but the people who write about violence, their ears are all pricking up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, every kind of practice is good to look at. I'm a scholar. I want to understand what others are doing and why they're doing it and how it fits into specific systems. And the idea of a kind of a generalizable set of principles or kind of invocations to violence, I don't know if it's a feasible political practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? I think back to Elizabeth Colbert appearing on the Ezra Klein show to talk about her book Under a White Sky. And, Klein, you basically asks Colbert the same question. Like, if we are at this impasse and it's clear that we're not moving fast enough, do we not just have to dismantle the social license of fossil fuel corporations, but the material stuff of oil based economies? And she kind of, in the same way you sort of pleaded scholar there, pleads journalist. She puts it in those terms, and says, like, it's really not my job to speculate on when violence is necessary. And that's what I hear you kind of saying. But at the same time, like,
Well, I would
you're
say
like leaving some room there, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
What I would say is the speculation doesn't generate the violence.
Mm.
So my own activity might do that,
Mm-hmm.
but then it would be I would want to create a revolutionary party. I would want to create some kind of group of individuals whom I could do the violence with.
Mm.
I would have to have some basis for it. I mean, we do. We have a great case study in a sense in Canada, which is Wiebo Ludwig, violence against fossil fuel extraction sites around his community, um, a religious community, a deeply conservative religious community, who takes it upon himself because he doesn't want his family's extended family injured. So there's a case of violence, which on its own doesn't guarantee the politics of the violence. So
Mm-hmm.
what Ludwig has is a very patriarchal religious society. There are definitely insiders and outsiders. It doesn't accept everybody into it. It's off grid. It's not inclusive. So we have examples of violence against pipelines, against facilities. They don't necessarily all cohere into something that is about the environment. They're about, at least to date, about climate change. They're about impacts on communities. They're very, very specific. They're not coordinated. It doesn't appear that they would be coordinated. So maybe I'm pleading journalist a bit, but I would say it a bit differently, which is that if right now I have two hats, one is a politician and one is an academic,
Mm-hmm.
and we started this discussion by trying to think about how or talking about how I see them together.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what I see in the political sphere is the kind of action that Ezra Klein demands. If
Mm.
one looks at the policy, the platform that I developed, which I will say in advance of telling you what it's about, was never challenged as being irrational or ridiculous or so out of measure that it couldn't be. I couldn't participate as an expert in discussions. Nobody said it showed my inexpertise in these matters or that I was a bad politician. The very first thing it says is that all extraction in Canada should stop as of 2023. Something demanded by activist groups, but actually also demanded by the International Energy Association as of late. So that's a radical action that would have consequences for industry. That would, in a sense, blow it all up. But it comes with a part B, which is that you attend to the needs and the impacts on those communities and the workers that are affected. Otherwise, there's going to be no buy-in. The violence is going to be in the other direction.
Hmm.
If the demand is about speed, there are ways to speed things up. Speed isn't necessarily generated by violence, which I'm not saying that it might not, if it's done on a mass scale, speed things up. Though, again, I'm not sure that it would have the results that one might expect, insofar as violence does not always kind of end up reinforcing one's own political position.
No.
But if speed is an issue, there are possibilities for undertaking that kind of speed. And they're done in a bureaucratic apparatus, in a classic neoliberal state. I mean, there's other elements of the Green Platform that are, left social justice framings of political issues.
Mm-hmm.
They're organized around the good state. I don't think I'm offending any of my colleagues in discussing it that way. I completely support that. But it is a belief in the state as being, if not the sole actor, then an intermediate actor in addressing climate change, on both on the scale and the speed required.
Mm-hmm.
The decision about speed then comes down to electorates, or the decision about speed maybe is part of the discussion that happens at places like COP, and which might inform political decision making.
And I wonder, and the only other question I guess I wanted to ask in relationship to speed is whether, or to what extent, you think it's possible in the current moment where we clearly are still. I mean, the pandemic has shown the ways in which nations are willing to garrison their borders. The coming waves of climate refugees, like where are these people going to go? Like, I wonder at this moment whether you think it's possible to think in a truly global way about climate change, because something Mike Davis has pointed out is that the difference with the pandemic is that it is immediately torpedoing markets globally. It needs to be solved because the system is disrupted. Whereas, climate change is something that in large part we can defer because it is afflicting, nations in the global south. One of the things certainly that White Skin Black Fuel argues is that racism inspires indifference to the problem of climate change, and yet fossil fuels represent, as they put it, the apogee of domination. So, if we're in the context where a certain kind of like racist nativism and fossil fascism is willing to just flatly deny all of it and double down, like, do you have any hope that it's possible to both decarbonize and decolonize? That it's possible to rely on a white settler state, a colonial state, to go profoundly in a different direction? Or, are we doomed to this, I guess, like racist categorization that doesn't allow for the connections to be made between immediate climate impacts in the Caribbean, for example, and the more abstract nature of the threat in Canada, which of course is no longer as abstract given the nature of the heat dome, the unprecedented heat dome that hit, of course, Western Canada. But do you think that these distances, that these perceived distances between nations, peoples, communities, are collapsing in the context of the climate emergency, or in fact just getting more strengthened?
The hard question to end things, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
I would say that there has. To, I'll try to address this as best I can. I don't like the um, trope of hope.
Sure.
Um, I think that again has a specific kind of communicative practice,
Mm-hmm.
which is not about analysis, or is not about kind of looking at the reality on the ground. Hope that realism isn't the substitute for hope. It's just that I think hope has a specific politics that I'd like to avoid. I would say that I'm not sure that there has ever been a moment when the reality of colonialism and its impacts have ever been as visible.
Mm.
that there is precisely discussion about the responsibilities of the global north, the global south. There is attention to the way in which this history of um, natural resource extraction has made one part of the world very wealthy at the expense of the rest of the world. One of the framing ideas of whatever it is that became environmental humanities is that there's this incredible apparatus that made it possible for there to, to be an epistemic blindness to petroculture, to petromodernity, even as it had a deep ontological, like ontologically shaped modernity. And that epistemic blindness, which is it's an odd one because it's kind of like you obviously know, and then of course you don't know, is starting to wither away. If somebody in the 1970s, post 1973 in the US, let's say it's 79 or something, had to tell you how the US made its money, it would of course have a sense of movies like Giant and others where there's like people in oil fields, they make a lot of cash and some of that cash comes for free and that's fine. But they wouldn't fundamentally see that as what the US is about. And now I think it's much more prevalent. We talk about energy, we talk about big oil day to day. It's part of the news cycle now. Mm-hmm. I think people recognize that. I'm not saying I think, I know it is the way that the world is connected together is much more visible. And the necessity of action on the part of one part of the world to help the rest is super clear. Mm-hmm. There's no discourse about Mauritania doubling down in order to help the US. So then the question is really, where does one like move the goalposts so that it's easier to get to the finish line? Wow, that's a mixed metaphor there, right?
But what are the tactics? And, what's the play?
Yeah, what are the tactics? What's going to happen? And again, coming back to the Suzuki, which I'm glad you started with. Mm-hmm. My response to your use of the Suzuki is that really this was you're talking about political revolution. And maybe the mistake is that the focus on the environment is the wrong one to achieve the ends of changing society to get to environmental change. The environment is something like, or can be something like, a tool to produce that change that we've always wanted, those of us on the left, and to insist that it has to happen quickly because it's no longer just about human actors that will be damaged, but some other larger network system, creature called Gaia that's going to be acted. It's as if this new actor has come into revolutionary politics. And it may be that that's taking us in directions that we might not have anticipated. So if we look at it that way, we have a situation now where lots of the forces that shape contemporary political life are on display as never before. This language of climate crisis has made that happen. And maybe now the direction to go is not towards advocating for geoengineering in the way some on the left do and lots on the right do, but to go back and think about what are the kinds of political changes we want and where do we get there. So with that in mind, perhaps violence should not be towards fossil fuel, like towards oil refineries or towards pipelines, though that happens as well. That gets one kind of change and maybe not the other. I suppose what I'm saying here is that there's this sense to me in the environmental movement that when you solve the environment, you then get like a social world that's already framed in social justice terms. And maybe it has to go the other way around. And maybe that means conceding lots of pain to the world, and maybe it means not getting us to the point we want. So maybe we need to do decolonization more than decarbonization, that maybe the two don't go together. These are at least some of the things I'm trying to figure out. That and this odd situation I've thrown myself into, which is a schizophrenic one of both being a member of a political party and still being a member of a political party at a high level and having to advocate for the positions of that party, and also being a cultural critic who may not agree with some of those same positions or may see them as limited to a kind of liberal democratic series of politics. I say that only because I've never felt a purism about politics in that sense. I think you go at it at every angle you can. I'm not the one that has to do all of the political maneuvering in the whole world. I have lots of colleagues. I can play both sides. This is an interesting moment for me. It's taken me in places I hadn't expected, this kind of dual personality. I think it would be great if a lot of my colleagues who know about critical theory would be in parliamentary politics. I don't see why that's an issue. I don't think it has to be one or the other.
Yeah, and it's so exciting to be able to like think through or hear you think through this and talk to you about these things. Like, it sounds like, you're facing yourself this kind of indeterminate path. Like you don't exactly know how to navigate it, and it's energizing to hear you kind of work through that. And I guess like also I wanted to say like, it's exciting to hear you talk about this feeling of being divided between hope, which you see as politically primarily about like, triggering, I think, the dopamine hit of just reassurance, and, preying on people's fear and despair. Like it's difficult to kind of navigate those two extremes. And yet that's precisely what I think environmental communication is trying to do right now. Anyway, I could talk to you forever, but I won't keep you any longer. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It was fantastic to talk to you.